Everyone has his superstitions. One of mine has always been when I started to go anywhere, or to do anything, never to turn back or to stop until the thing intended was accomplished. Ulysses S. Grant. During his life, Ulysses S. Grant fought 2 wars. One, of course, being the devastating Civil War that split the United States of America in half for several bloody years. But he also fought another after the massive bloodshed had ended, a political war to protect the rights of former slaves who were living in the southern part of the country, a part of the nation still tense from the recent conflict, with some people taking matters into their own hands, terrorizing African Americans, and it was up to Grant to deal with their actions. Welcome to the latest entry in our Presidential Park series, where we take a look at United States presidents through the national parks that honor and define them, and starting with Grant, the parks they created to preserve for future generations. But we'll get to that in due time. Let's turn back the clock now, all the way back to where it all began for Hiram Ulysses Grant. Here we go. Grant was a well-traveled man throughout his life, but his journey started in Point Pleasant, Ohio in 1822. His father was a tanner, but also an abolitionist, opposed to the enslavement of several million African Americans in the agriculturally dominated South. Grant would encounter both pro- and anti-slavery viewpoints from various people as the issue slowly drove the nation apart, and hearing these different perspectives would greatly influence him when it came to taking his own position on the matter as the nation entered into civil war almost 40 years after his birth. At the age of 17, Grant was sent off to West Point Military Academy for official training. Despite being born Hiram Ulysses Grant, an admissions mix-up had him down as Ulysses S. Grant, and at the risk of not being let into the academy unless he changed his name, Hiram became Ulysses, and H.U.G. Hug Grant was no more, replaced with the more patriotic U.S. Grant. Graduating from West Point, Grant's first post had him stationed along the Mississippi River south of St. Louis, Missouri, at Jefferson Barracks, now a National Guard base, National Cemetery, and County Park. While at Jefferson Barracks, Grant reconnected with a roommate from West Point, Frederick Dent, whose family owned a sizable plantation in the area. Grant went out and visited this plantation, known as Whitehaven, and also met the head of the household, Colonel Dent, and his daughter Julia, who Grant would eventually take a romantic interest in. Grant would become deeply connected with the home and surrounding area, and today some of the original plantation acreage, along with the Whitehaven home, is preserved as Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site. Over the next few years, Ulysses would form a close connection with Julia, and eventually proposed, but to no avail. He tried again in 1844, and this time Julia accepted, but they would not be together for long, as war had just broken out on the southern US border, and Grant was assigned to join the army to handle the conflict. It was while he was fighting the Mexican-American War that Grant began to acquire additional military skills, real-life combat experience as opposed to academy training, that would go on to help him succeed in the Civil War. Following the war, Grant returned to St. Louis and had an official wedding with Julia. He didn't remain in St. Louis for long, however, assigned to peacetime duty farther east for the next several months, before being sent off to California due to the immense influx of settlers caused by the gold rush, and having to leave Julia and his son Fred behind, as Julia was expecting a second son, who was not born in the short time Grant had to prepare for duty. Grant spent some time at Fort Vancouver, now Fort Vancouver National Historic Site, and the new Fort Humboldt, in the area of what is now Redwood National and State Parks. While out on the West Coast, he became very lonely and took to drinking. The Army eventually caught wind of Grant's new habit and gave him 2 options, the choice to resign or be discharged. Grant chose resignation and in 1854 moved back to Whitehaven, where he would live with Julia and their children for the next 5 years. Grant attempted to make a living as a farmer while in the St. Louis area, even building a cabin called Hardscrabble north of the Whitehaven estate, but he found little success at the job. Hoping to find a better life elsewhere, Grant went on the move again, this time 6 hours north of St. Louis to Galena, Illinois, to work at his father, who you may remember was a tanner's, leather shop. It was while Grant lived in Galena when the tension over slavery that had been building for years finally broke out into civil war. Now, the next few years of Grant's life are fairly fast-paced, but we'll quickly run through some of the sites related to Grant's path during the Civil War. Joining a volunteer corps, Grant made his way down from Illinois through Missouri, eventually re-entering the Union Army for the first time since his resignation. In early 1862, Grant captured Forts Henry and Donelson, now preserved as a national battlefield, by requiring that he would only accept an unconditional and immediate surrender from the opposing Confederate troops, earning him the nickname Unconditional Surrender U.S. Grant, and giving the Union Army what is now widely considered its first major victory in the war. Pushing through Kentucky and Tennessee, winning a battle at Shiloh, now Shiloh National Military Park, Grant and President Abraham Lincoln now set their sights on the key city of Vicksburg, Mississippi, which, when taken, would allow the Union to control the Mississippi River, a major transportation route. After several tumultuous months fighting to get within reach of the city, and then another few months laying siege to the river town, Grant finally captured the strategic port on July 4, 1863, just in time to celebrate the anniversary of America's independence. Vicksburg, like Shiloh, is now a national military park. Speaking of independence, in January of that year, President Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing all slaves in the Confederacy. Before the war, Grant had heard Colonel Dent argue his pro-slavery values, as well as hearing news about abolitionists and what they were doing to fight back against enslavement. During the war, Grant found himself growing more and more in favor of the abolishment of slavery, and shortly after the fall of Vicksburg, as increasing numbers of African Americans were admitted to the U.S. Army, Grant stated that the arming of African Americans had gained them a powerful ally. In March of 1864, impressed with Grant's victories out west, Lincoln placed him in charge of all Union armies, meaning that Grant would be in the east for the remainder of the war, pitted against one of the Confederacy's smartest generals, Robert E. Lee. The first battle that saw Grant face Lee was in a place known as the Wilderness, and from there he pursued Lee towards the Confederate capital of Richmond, only to experience a setback at the Battle of Cold Harbor and settle in for his second major siege of the war at the town of Petersburg, south of Richmond and now protected by the National Park Service as Petersburg National Battlefield. Finally, after months of waiting, Grant sensed Lee's armies were vulnerable enough to be taken out once and for all. In early April 1865, Grant ordered an assault to break the siege, and it worked. Lee's forces fled the area, opening up the capital of Richmond for Union armies to take control of. Lee retreated for another week before Grant finally quartered him in a small town called Appomattox, and Lee had no choice but to surrender. Today, Appomattox Courthouse National Historical Park commemorates this historic event. More tragedy was to come even after Lee's surrender, however, when President Lincoln was murdered as a part of a larger assassination plot to take out several high-ranking government officials, Grant among them. Grant was luckier than Lincoln, managing to escape the same fate by leaving the nation's capital before the plot panned out. Lincoln was succeeded by Andrew Johnson, who initially had a lot of potential to oversee the reconstruction of the nation, but quickly began to cause tension with Congress. Grant, on the other hand, was immensely popular after the war, and soon talks began to see if he would run for president. Although Grant preferred military life, he felt that he was the person who could truly reunite the nation, and so he accepted the Republican nomination and won the 1868 election in a landslide. Grant did many things as president, but here are two of his most prominent. In the former Confederate states following the Civil War, many African Americans were struggling to have the right to vote, due to organizations like the White League and the Ku Klux Klan that were terrorizing Black Americans in the South. Because of this, Grant helped to get the 15th Amendment to the Constitution passed and ratified, securing all men the right to vote regardless of their location or background. He also passed the Ku Klux Klan Act, which cracked down on the white supremacist group and extinguished it for several decades. And at last, we get to the president who established the first national park, the idea that would spawn so many others, and of course inspired the idea for this very YouTube channel itself. On March 1, 1872, Grant turned the Yellowstone geothermal and geological wonders of Northwest Wyoming Territory into America's first national park. RAC Adventures recognizes that presidents have helped to establish over 400 national park units, and while we don't have time to list every park each president created, we will highlight some of the major parks creation dates and legislation that relates to the continued development of the parks and eventually the National Park Service. Grant was re-elected in 1872, but scandals by people close to him damaged his reputation, and in 1876, Grant stepped down for the presidency. Following a 2-year world tour that took Grant and Julia across the Eurasian continent, the Grant settled down in the state of New York. Unfortunately for Grant, he was in a poor position at this time. After his son's business firm scammed him out of a large sum of money, Ulysses was left destitute, in addition to discovering he had throat cancer caused by excessive cigar smoking, which traced itself back to people sending him dozens of them, following a picture of him smoking one being published in newspapers after his victory at Forts Henry and Donelson back in the Civil War. Grant knew he had to find a way to provide his family with enough money to carry on after he passed, as it was becoming apparent he did not have much longer to live. Therefore, he set out writing a book of memoirs about his life, finishing just days before he died, and published to the famous author Mark Twain. Grant would be buried in New York City, and when Julia passed at the beginning of the 20th century, she was placed alongside him in the tomb put under the jurisdiction of the National Park Service in 1958 as General Grant National Memorial. Ulysses S. Grant has been called many things: the savior of the Union during the Civil War, sometimes called a failure in everything but love and war, but there is no doubt about it that Grant certainly left his mark on American history. From the West Point graduate, to the failed farmer, to the Civil War general and President of the United States, Ulysses S. Grant never turned back until he accomplished what he wanted to do. And like Grant, you've just arrived at the accomplishment of completing this video. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, visit the RAC Presidential Park Series, signing off.